Welcome, searchers and seekers. We are in the New Testament now, and we're looking at the Gospel of Mark. And in your English Bibles, usually Matthew comes first, and Mark is the second Gospel. But almost all scholars believe that Mark was the earliest Gospel written. So, what is a Gospel? In Greek, it's euangelion. And the gospel is an old English word, good spell, and the spell means a story or history or tale, history. So we get our word magic spell from the same root, but the good spell is a gospel, is the translation of euangelion, and euangelion, the eu means good, and angelion means message or news. So that's the good news. That's the little Greek meaning. So it's just a word that meant good news. So it's probably better to translate it good news than gospel, because gospel sort of sounds like its own distinct genre. But in ancient Greek times, when this was written, it would not have been understood as anything but euangelion. So we get our word angel from angelos, which is the same as angelion, the same root. So an angel is someone who's a messenger most of the time. So that's a way of remembering euangelion. Also, our word evangelist or evangelical is a more direct translation of euangelion. The Gospel of Mark was written by someone we don't really know who. Mark was added much later on as an author, but all the Gospels are anonymous, and names were added in the 2nd century. And apparently none of the writers of the Gospels were eyewitnesses. None of them actually knew Jesus, according to what scholars say. Scholars think that the Gospel of Mark is written after 67, probably after the persecution by Nero and then the Roman wars against Israel, because those persecutions and wars are mentioned in the gospel. They are put into the mouth of Jesus as a prophecy of what will happen. But scholars are not taking that literally, but as a prophecy after the fact. And so the gospel is dated there. In the 60s. I mean, I suppose you could say, well, no, those were real prophecies by Jesus who knew what was going to happen. But in any case, we don't know who wrote this gospel. Mark was added much later. We don't know where it was written and when it was written. We don't know the relationship of the author of the Gospel of Mark, this anonymous gospel. We don't know his relation to any of the other disciples. It's sort of totally anonymous. And looking at the very end of the gospel, it's very interesting that there's no real account of the resurrection. Maybe chapter 16 just ends. Maybe it was not finished. Maybe part of the scroll was removed. Maybe the author wanted just to leave that impact. But there are a couple of endings that were added later because people felt, oh, the gospel ends prematurely. So we'll look at that later at the end. So this is a major part of the Gospel of Mark. It's the large amount of miracle stories, healings, exorcisms that make up a large portion of Mark. And Raymond Brown, in his Introduction to the New Testament on page 133, quotes that half of Mark's account of the public ministry of Jesus, about 200 out of 450 verses, deal with miracles. And so this is a very large part of how the Gospel of Mark sees the ministry of Jesus, the public ministry, what he did out in public, not just talking to disciples or other narrative elements. But as far as Jesus was seen in public amongst the people, miracles are a very large part of it. And then the question is, why do we have these miracles that are healings, exorcisms, and at the same time, Jesus is telling people not to proclaim this, telling the demons not to proclaim this. And that is a question. Why do we have that reticence? Why do we have that attempt to silence this information? And it seems somewhat of a contradiction because Jesus is performing all of these miracles. It's a major part of how he appears on the scene. And yet he's saying he does not want his true identity to be revealed. Part of the answer to this is also something that Raymond Brown offers on page 129 of Introduction to the New Testament. He says that the writers of the gospel don't want to accept that the demons have the ability to name Jesus, because in that society, naming is very important. Here's what Raymond Brown says. Although it invokes a true title, that does not really catch the mystery of the person. End of quote. So Jesus. So while the demons are recognizing Jesus as the Holy One of God, he silences them. And part of the reason for that is maybe to keep the drama intense, but also for this reason, that just knowing that name does not fully disclose the identity of Jesus. We are left with a mystery, why this public ministry of Jesus is so focused on very public, evident miracles that proclaim his very unique status. And at the same time, he wants people and demons to be silent about it. And that also leaves us with the issue that Mark's gospel very much sees Jesus as a miracle worker, giving these signs and wonders. And many biblical scholars, many scholars, just do not accept the historicity of these miracles. They do not accept that these miracles were real because there's no evidence for it, and they seem to be fictional. So the first verse begins, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. We've already talked about the good news, the euangelion, in Jesus Christ. So Jesus was the given name, his first name, we could say, and in the Aramaic, it probably would have been something like Yeshua. And in the Greek of the New Testament, it is Jesus, and that's where we get our Jesus from. Christ means anointed. So in the ancient Hebrew times, a high priest or prophet or king would be anointed. They would have oil smeared on their heads, and this would be for only offices that would be directly under God. They weren't offices that were under any sort of supervisor. So Christ means anointed, and the Hebrew is Mashiach or Messiah, and that comes from the word to anoint, to rub oil on the forehead, for example. And that's the same as the Greek Kreo or Christ. That's what anointed means. So anointed for a special task directly under God. Verse 1 also calls Jesus Christ the Son of God, but that phrase is not in many of the ancient texts. It's in some, not in others. So it's difficult to think, why would anyone remove Son of God from a text? But it's easy to think why someone would add that title. So the Son of God is not something that equates with God. There are many people in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, who are described as Son of God. And we would use the phrase, oh, he's a godly person. That doesn't mean that that person is God. It means that they're holy, they're pious, they're righteous, they're godly, they're good people, a good person. So Son of God says the same thing. It means a holy person close to God who follows God's commandments. In verse 2, there is a quotation from the prophet Isaiah. See, I am sending my message ahead of you who will prepare your way. The voice of one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight. That's actually a conflation of different sources from the Old Testament, Isaiah, Exodus, and Malachi. It does come from Isaiah chapter 40, verse 3. And if we look at Isaiah chapter 40, verse 3, a voice cries out, in the wilderness prepare the way of Yahweh. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God, Elohim. Every valley shall be lifted up, and every mountain and hill shall be made low. The uneven ground shall become level. A voice says, cry out. And I said, what should I cry? All people are grass. Their constancy is like the flower of the field. So all people are like grass. Grass dies in the summer if it's an annual grass. So the lifespan of human beings is very short. And that's a beautiful and telling image from the Hebrew Scriptures for mortality, for the impermanence of human life. But this verse here, verse 3, is really not predicting the coming of a Messiah or someone who is before the Messiah to prepare his way. This is a general way of comforting the people of God. So it's not like this prophecy from Isaiah is a prophecy of Jesus Christ coming. It's a general way of saying comfort to the people, always prepare a way to the Lord. It's not like it's a proof text that proves Jesus is the Son of God. In verse 10, the Holy Spirit, or the Spirit, is said as descending like a dove. And some people say, some scholars suggest, not really so much looking like a dove, but hovering like a dove, floating down like a dove. And that may relate to the Genesis account of creation where the Spirit of God was floating, hovering above the waters. In verses 12 and 13, Jesus spends 40 days in the desert, 40 the number for a large, complete event, like the 40 days of the flood. Here, Jesus spends 40 days in the desert. Jesus then exorcises unclean spirits or demons from people. He cures people of various diseases. He cures someone of leprosy. Leprosy is a generic term. It may not mean just leprosy, but any sort of skin disease. So here we have these miracle stories, and the demons inside tend to know Jesus, but he will not allow them to speak. I'm not sure why, but that's a characteristic of the Gospel of Mark, that Jesus' true identity as the Holy One of God is not going to be allowed to be said by demons, although in the Gospel of Mark it is being said that he is the Holy One of God. So I'm not quite sure why these demons have to be silenced. The philosopher David Hume had an argument against these type of miracles. And the effect of that, generally speaking, is that there's a high probability that the person giving the evidence for these miracles could be deceived, him or herself, or be a deceiver. So there's always a great possibility or probability that the evidence for these miracles is wrong. But we could look at this in terms of mythology. We could look at the miracles as part of mythological typology of showing that this is a holy person. So a holy person does miracles, so it's speaking the language of the day. So that is not to take them literally, but as metaphors for healing. And where does this come from? Well, we can think of the ancient time that this came from. The Roman Empire was in full power, population had increased. There were a lot of people, and medical care was very minimal to non-existent. So people were suffering from all sorts of ailments and really suffering existentially. So they're looking for some sort of healing. And again, Mark has shown no evidence of knowing Jesus. There's no personal account. And we do not even know Mark's true name. We don't know who exactly wrote this gospel. It's anonymous. The name Mark was added decades and decades and decades later, according to our best manuscripts. So this is someone, an anonymous source, who may or may not have spoke to anyone who actually knew Jesus. And so where are the people who were healed? What are they saying? Are they still giving personal firsthand accounts? I don't know if that happened. We don't have evidence for that. We don't know who Mark was. We don't know who the people who were allegedly healed were. So it may be best to take this non-literally as something that there's no historical evidence for, and more as a metaphorical statement about God and Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as a healer, ushering in a new kingdom, a new age of God's presence.